In July 1944, an American P-51 Mustang pilot, flying one of the best fighter planes in the world, saw something he couldn't explain. Two white contrails were climbing vertically into the stratosphere at a speed no aircraft should have been able to reach. Before he could react, two small, swept-wing aircraft sliced through his formation like bullets and disappeared into the clouds before anyone had even processed what had happened. Colonel Avalon Takon described it in his official report. I estimate, conservatively, they were doing between 500 and 600 miles per hour. Nobody could intercept them. Nobody could follow them. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. The encounter lasted less than 15 seconds, and when it was over, every pilot in that formation sat in silence, trying to understand what had just passed through their airspace. What those pilots didn't know was that the weapon they had just encountered was already killing its own pilots. More of them, in fact, than it had ever killed of the enemy. Nazi Germany had a problem in 1944. American B-17 flying fortresses were crossing the skies of the Reich in formations of over 1,000 planes. Entire cities were being reduced to rubble. The synthetic oil refineries that kept German tanks and aircraft moving were being systematically destroyed. Their conventional fighters couldn't catch them at altitude. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, the best piston engine fighters Germany had, couldn't reach the bombers fast enough, couldn't climb to their ceiling in time, and once there, couldn't stay long enough to make a real difference. Germany needed something radically different, and they had it. They had been developing it in secret for years, under a name so deliberately unremarkable, it was almost a joke: Project X. It all started with a man named Alexander Lippisch, an eccentric, obsessive engineer who had spent his entire career designing gliders that didn't look like anything else in the sky. While the rest of Germany was building conventional fighters with straight wings and propellers, Lippisch was designing something that looked like it came straight out of a science fiction film. A small, tailless aircraft with swept delta wings, no vertical tail, no traditional fuselage shape. Something that looked more like a flying wing or a manta ray than a warplane. His obsession with radical glider design had begun in the 1920s when Germany was banned from building military aircraft under the Treaty of Versailles, but had been left free to develop sport gliders. In that strange legal gap, German aviation engineers had quietly built some of the most advanced aerodynamic research programs in the world. Lippisch was at the center of it. He designed more than 50 gliders in the interwar years, each one more radical than the last. By the time the war began, he understood swept-wing aerodynamics better than almost anyone alive. The project was so secret they didn't even give it a new name. They assigned it the designation Me-163, the number of a completely different Messerschmitt aircraft, a mundane liaison plane that had never gone into production, precisely so that if any Allied spy discovered references to the project, they would assume it applied to something old and irrelevant and move on. The deception worked. For years, Allied intelligence had no idea what was coming. But what happened on October 2nd, 1941 changed the history of aviation forever. Test pilot Heini Dittmar pushed the throttle at the secret research base in Peenemünde, and the small aircraft shot toward the horizon. The acceleration was unlike anything Dittmar had ever felt in a cockpit. The sound barrier, still a theoretical concept at that point, something aeronautical engineers argued about in lecture halls, was suddenly a real thing rushing toward him. When he landed and they reviewed the instruments, nobody could believe what they showed. Dittmar had reached 1,004 kilometers per hour in level flight, over 1,000 kilometers per hour. It was the first piloted aircraft in history to achieve it. Years before Chuck Yeager famously broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 in 1947, a German test pilot in a wood and metal rocket glider had pushed past the edge of what anyone thought possible. The engineers called it the Komet, the Comet. It was a perfect name. It arrived fast, burned bright and terrifying across the sky, and faded just as quickly. They should have paid closer attention to that last part. The Komet was, on its face, a masterpiece of engineering ambition. It climbed to 12,000 meters in under 4 minutes, a climb rate that left every contemporary aircraft staring at its contrail and wondering if they had imagined it. Its top speed of over 960 kilometers per hour made it not just the fastest aircraft of the war, but faster than anything that would fly in combat for nearly a decade afterward. Test pilot Rudolf Opitz, the aircraft's chief test pilot, said it could fly circles around any other fighter of its time. Pilots who flew it described the sensation of going from a standing start on the runway to 40,000 feet in the time it took to smoke a cigarette. At high speed and in unpowered, gliding flight, it was described as elegant, responsive, almost playful. Even test pilot Hanna Reitsch, Germany's most celebrated aviator, a woman who had flown every type of aircraft the Luftwaffe possessed, described the Komet's handling as extraordinary. That endorsement would come with consequences she hadn't anticipated. But there was a problem. A problem every engineer on the project had known about from day one. A problem that was not a design flaw, or a manufacturing defect, or something that could be fixed with better engineering. It was baked into the fundamental concept of the aircraft, into the very fuel that made its performance possible. And no one in the chain of command was willing to stop the program because of it. The fuel that made the Komet the fastest aircraft in the world was literally capable of dissolving human flesh. Alexander Lippisch himself described it with a single sentence that became infamous among the engineers who worked on the program. When asked about the aircraft's propellant, Lippisch said, "If you stick your finger in it, then you get only the bone out." He was not speaking loosely. He was not exaggerating for effect. He was describing with complete precision what the fuel did to organic material on contact. The Walter HWK-509 engine that powered the production Me-163B ran on two substances the engineers designated T-Stoff and C-Stoff. The T-Stoff was hydrogen peroxide, concentrated to 80% purity, not remotely comparable to the diluted hydrogen peroxide found in pharmacies, but a violently reactive industrial oxidizer that spontaneously ignited anything organic it touched: cloth, wood, leather, rubber, human skin. The C-Stoff was a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol, a combination that was carcinogenic, highly toxic when inhaled, and capable of causing severe chemical burns on contact. Alone, each substance was dangerous. Together, they were what chemists call hypergolic, meaning that when they made contact with each other, the resulting explosion required no ignition source, no spark, no heat. Contact alone was sufficient to detonate them instantly and completely. The engineers knew this. They built the aircraft anyway. And then, they put human beings inside it. The ground crews who fueled the Komet wore asbestos-lined suits and full-face protection. In practice, they were inadequate. Any splash, any leak, any vapor seeping into the cockpit during fueling was potentially fatal. The two fuels were both colorless and odorless in certain conditions, making detection nearly impossible. Without instruments nobody carried. Ground mechanics developed an almost superstitious set of rituals around fueling, loading one propellant at a time, flushing the engine with water between each flight, triple-checking valves and couplings before anyone came within range. They called themselves the Black Men for the dark overalls they wore, and they worked on the Komets with the careful, deliberate movements of people who understood that a single mistake would be their last. On one ordinary day at a Luftwaffe maintenance base, a ground mechanic poured a canister of T-Stoff into a storage drum that still contained a small residual quantity of C-Stoff. He didn't see the residue. The containers were identical. The liquids were colorless. Author William Green documented what happened in the account that would be quoted for decades afterward. Before he realized the magnitude of his mistake, his remains had been spread thinly over the entire test shed. There was no delay, no warning, no moment to react. The explosion was instantaneous and absolute. One moment a man was doing his job, the next the shed had to be cleaned. But the most disturbing story, the one that circulated in whispers among Komet pilots and ground crews, the one that made even hardened veterans go quiet, was the story of Josef Pöhs. Pöhs was 31 years old. He was a decorated Luftwaffe ace, a recipient of the Knight's Cross, the highest military honor in the German armed forces, awarded for shooting down 41 enemy aircraft over the Eastern Front. He was the kind of pilot the Me-163 program desperately needed. Experienced, fearless, technically skilled, physically exceptional. He was transferred to the Komet test unit in 1943 with the same mix of pride and curiosity that most of the program's pilots described. He had no reason to expect anything other than the hardest, most exciting challenge of his flying career. On December 30th, 1943, during takeoff at Bad Zwischenahn, the wheeled dolly that the Komet used for ground roll released too early under the airframe. It bounced off the runway, struck the fuselage, and ruptured a T-Stoff fuel line. The engine shut down immediately. Pöhs, now piloting an unpowered aircraft, still accelerating down the runway with a ruptured fuel line, leaking corrosive oxidizer into the cockpit, did exactly what his training had prepared him to do. He attempted a dead-stick emergency landing, trying to bring the aircraft down in the airfield's grass margins. He almost made it. The nose skid, caught rough ground just beyond the runway. The aircraft pitched forward and flipped inverted. There was no fire. There was no explosion. The watching pilots and ground crew breathed a moment of relief. Then they ran toward the wreckage.
When they reached the inverted Komet and turned it upright, what they found in the cockpit made several of the men turn away. The T-Stoff that had been flooding from the ruptured line had been pooling around Pöhs as he lay unconscious inside the sealed cockpit. His right arm had been completely disintegrated, not burned, not torn, dissolved. The other arm, his chest, and his head were described by multiple eyewitnesses as little more than soft jelly. One mechanic described looking into the cockpit and seeing nothing but vapors, a sweet chemical smell, and a pink foam collecting at the lowest point of the inverted fuselage. His best friend, Commander Wolfgang Spata, ordered everyone not directly involved in the recovery to leave the scene. He stood there alone for a long time before giving any further orders. He later wrote that he hoped, for Pöhs's sake, that the crash itself had killed him before the fuel reached him. And yet the flights continued, within days. Because the Nazi high command could not afford to stop them, the war was being lost on every front simultaneously. The synthetic oil plants at Leuna and Merseburg, the refineries that the Me-163 was specifically designed to protect, were being destroyed by the very bomber formations the Komet was meant to stop. Hermann Göring was under direct pressure from Hitler to produce results. The Komet was Germany's last credible hope for a technological solution to the air war. And so the test flights continued, and the training flights continued, and pilots climbed into cockpits that smelled faintly of chemicals, and told themselves that the accident that happened to Pöhs wouldn't happen to them. Some of them were right. Many of them were not. To fly the Komet at all, pilots had to survive a training program that was itself a filter for the merely brave versus the recklessly committed. They began in unpowered gliders called Stummelhabicht, Stubhawk, aircraft that simulated the Komet's extreme landing characteristics: high approach speed, single chance to land, no possibility of a go-around. You committed to the landing from the moment you began your approach, and if you misjudged it, you crashed. There were no second attempts. Pilots who couldn't handle that learned it in the training glider rather than in the rocket plane, which was the best possible outcome. Those who passed moved on to powered flights in the Me-163A, then the 163B with the full Walter engine. Along the way, they learned to live without pressurized cockpits at altitudes where nitrogen bubbles could form in their bloodstreams if they climbed too fast. The same condition that killed deep-sea divers who surfaced too quickly. They were required to follow strict low-fiber diets for days before flights, because at the Comet's climb rate, gas trapped in the gastrointestinal tract expanded rapidly enough to cause agonizing pain and potentially incapacitate a pilot at altitude. They underwent altitude chamber training. They were issued the Mypolin suits and told to treat the fuel as though it were trying to kill them, because it was. And then they climbed in and flew. The Comet's operational career began in earnest in August 1944, when the newly formed Jagdgeschwader 400, JG-400, the Luftwaffe's only rocket fighter wing, began flying combat missions from its base at Brandis, east of Leipzig. Their primary mission was to protect the Leuna-Merseburg oil refineries, roughly 90 kilometers away. The logic was sound on paper. A rocket fighter that could reach 40,000 feet in under 4 minutes and cruise at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour could theoretically reach the bombers long before conventional fighters, scatter the formations, and return to base before the escort fighters could respond. The Comet pilots were, almost to a man, volunteers. Wolfgang Spate later wrote of them, "They were all filled with an intractable urge to serve their fatherland in a special way. They were ready to give their lives in order to fulfill their dream of flying in a rocket." But even if you survived the fuel, even if the engine didn't explode on the runway, even if you made it through training without incident, even if you climbed to altitude with both tanks intact and the Walter motor burning perfectly behind you, you still faced a problem that no one had fully anticipated before the aircraft entered combat. A problem that turned out to be one of the strangest tactical paradoxes in the history of aerial warfare. The Comet was too fast to fight effectively. Not metaphorically, literally, physically, mathematically, too fast to do the job it had been built to do. Imagine you are a Comet pilot in the autumn of 1944. You have survived everything the training program could throw at you. You have survived the fuel. You have survived the landings. You are climbing vertically through a cold German sky, the Walter motor burning a hole in the air behind you, the altimeter spinning upward faster than your eyes can track it. In under 4 minutes, you are at 12,000 meters. Below you, spread across 40 kilometers of airspace, is a formation of over 1,000 American B-17 flying fortresses, each one carrying 10 men and several tons of bombs pointed at a German city. You are the most advanced combat aircraft in the world. You are faster than anything the Allies have. And you have, from the moment your engine cuts out, somewhere between 6 and 8 minutes of powered flight remaining before the Comet becomes a glider. You push the nose down into the formation. The airspeed indicator climbs past 800 kilometers per hour. You pick a target, a B-17 flying at around 300 kilometers per hour, lumbering along, enormous, impossible to miss if you have enough time. But you don't have enough time. At the closing speed you are generating, you have approximately 3 seconds from the moment the bomber fills your gun sight to the moment you pass it. 3 seconds. The Mk-108 cannons mounted in your wings hold only 60 rounds each. In 3 seconds, you can fire perhaps 8 or 10 rounds. The cannon requires 3 or 4 hits to bring down a heavy bomber. The math is unforgiving. You fire a short burst. Half your shooting solution is gone before your finger has fully depressed the trigger. And then the bomber has passed below your nose, and you are already 500 meters beyond it, still accelerating. The moment already over. Pilots tried to solve this with looping attacks, coming up from below, firing upward, pulling through and away. They tried diving through the formation from above, then pulling up and repeating. Feldwebel Siegfried Schubert, the most successful Comet pilot of the war, was credited with shooting down 3 bombers. 3. That was the highest individual score achieved by any pilot flying the most advanced aircraft Germany could build. The entire JG-400, flying hundreds of combat sorties over more than a year of operations, confirmed fewer than 9 kills. against formations of bombers that sometimes numbered over 1,000 aircraft. The engineers came up with desperate solutions. The most unconventional was a weapon system called the Sondergerät 500 Jägerfaust, a battery of 6 50mm upward-firing mortars mounted vertically in the fuselage, aimed straight up, designed to be triggered automatically by a photosensitive cell in the aircraft's skin. The concept was genuinely clever. The Komet would fly underneath a bomber at high speed. The shadow of the bomber would fall across the photosensitive cell, and the mortars would fire upward into the bomber's belly without the pilot needing to aim at all. In testing, it worked. In combat, it was documented to work exactly once. A single Halifax bomber was reportedly destroyed by this method. Once. And when the fuel ran out, when that moment of silence arrived in the cockpit, the instant transition from roaring acceleration to absolute quiet that every Komet pilot described as the most disorienting sensation of their flying career, the most advanced fighter in the world became the most vulnerable aircraft in the sky. A glider. A fast one and a maneuverable one, but a glider nonetheless. Unable to accelerate, unable to climb, committed to landing at whatever airfield was within gliding range. Allied escort pilots learned this within weeks. The tactic they developed was brutally simple. Don't engage the Komet when it has power. You can't catch it anyway. Instead, watch where it goes, follow it to its airfield from a safe distance, and wait. The Komet will land. The Komet has no choice but to land. And when it does, touching down at 220 kilometers per hour on a belly skid with no ability to go around and no defensive maneuvering available, it becomes the easiest target imaginable. The landing was the final ordeal every Komet pilot faced at the end of every single flight. The aircraft had no conventional undercarriage. It took off on a wheeled dolly that was jettisoned immediately after liftoff and landed on a retractable skid built into the belly of the fuselage. Every landing was a committed one-shot approach with no possibility of correction. If you were too high, too fast, or aimed at the wrong piece of ground, you crashed. There was no throttle to add power and go around. There was no second chance. Coming in at over 200 kilometers per hour on a strip of grass, if the ground was uneven or if you were slightly off axis, the skid would catch, the nose would pitch, and the Komet would cartwheel. If any fuel remained in the tanks, even a small amount, even a residual splash, the probability of explosion was extremely high. Wolfgang Späte himself, the unit commander, a pre-war gliding champion, and an 80 victory ace who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, was nearly killed 3 separate times by the Komet's peculiarities. On one occasion, a negative G maneuver during an attempted intercept caused his engine to flame out mid-engagement, and he spent 2 agonizing minutes gliding unpowered at altitude while 4 Allied fighters flew nearby, apparently not noticing the small red bat-winged aircraft drifting in their airspace. He later wrote with characteristic dry humor, "I'm more than curious to know whatever happened to those pilots who possibly owe their lives to the fact that there was no Mach warning device in the Me-163. Hanna Reich fared worse. During a test flight, the Komet's jettison dolly failed to release cleanly on takeoff, hanging from the fuselage and creating violent vibration that made the aircraft nearly impossible to control at low speed. It stalled at approximately 30 meters above the ground. The impact gave her 6 skull fractures and a displaced upper jaw. She recovered. She went back to flying. She considered this a reasonable outcome. By early 1945, the walls were closing in from every direction at once. The 2 main T-Stoff production facilities had been bombed and severely damaged in September 1944. By the final months of the war, JG-400 was being rationed to approximately 50 fully fueled flights before Brandis Airfield would run completely dry. The Allies, once they understood the Komet's operational pattern, had simply stopped routing their bomber formations within range of the airfields where the Komets were based. The program that had promised to change the course of the air war was running out of fuel, running out of pilots, and running out of war. By the end, approximately 370 comets had been manufactured. Of those, only a fraction ever saw actual combat. The entire program confirmed fewer than 9 kills in over a year of combat operations. 10 comets were lost in enemy action. An unknown but larger number were lost to accidents, fuel disasters, and landing catastrophes. The program had killed more German pilots, ground crew, and mechanics than Allied airmen. In military terms, the Me-163 was one of the most expensive and consequential failures of the entire German war effort. But the story doesn't end in the wreckage of JG-400's final operations in the spring of 1945. It continues in the laboratories of the countries that defeated Germany and immediately scrambled to understand what German engineers had built. The Americans, British, Soviets, and French all captured comets in the final weeks of the war. The British took 48 intact aircraft from JG-400's last base at Husum. The Americans captured 5 and shipped them back to Freeman Field in Indiana, then flew one of them under tow behind a B-29 at Muroc Dry Lake in California, while Dr. Lippisch himself stood on the ground and watched. The Japanese, who had received partial plans for the aircraft via U-boat before the end of the war, built their own version, the Mitsubishi J-8M1 Shusui. They flew it once in a powered test in July 1945. The engine cut out on takeoff. The aircraft crashed. The pilot died. Even the copy killed its pilot. Alexander Lippisch was brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, the classified program through which American authorities recruited German scientists whose knowledge was considered too valuable to leave behind. He spent years at the Collins Radio Company in Iowa, then at the U.S. Navy, continuing to refine the Delta Wing designs he had pioneered in Germany. His influence on American aviation in the 1950s and 60s is visible in aircraft like the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger and the F-106 Delta Dart, fighters that look like something that evolved directly from the shape of the comet, as though Lippisch's original idea had simply been given better fuel and a longer runway. The comet arrived too late, with the wrong fuel in the wrong war to do what it had been designed to do. It was conceived as a revolutionary weapon and became instead a monument to the gap between what engineers could envision and what war, time, and the hard physics of operational reality could sustain. The pilots who flew it were not naive. They knew what had happened to Pöhs. They knew what the fuel did. They wore their asbestos suits and followed their pre-flight checklists and launched themselves into the sky on a column of hypergolic fire. Because they believed, or needed to believe, that what they were doing mattered enough to justify the risk. For most of them, it didn't change the war by a single hour, but it changed everything about what came after. Today, 10 comets survive in museums around the world. One is at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington. Another is at the RAF Museum in London. There are examples in Canada, Australia, and Germany. They are small, smaller than you expect when you see one in person. The fuselage is barely 5.5 meters long. Standing next to one, it is almost impossible to understand how a human being fit inside it, let alone manage to operate it at the edge of the sound barrier while wearing an asbestos suit and hoping that none of the colorless liquid in the tanks behind them chose that moment to decide contact had been made. They look less like weapons of war than like engineering thought experiments, questions made out of aluminum and wood that someone decided to fly before they had finished working out all the answers. But someone climbed into each one of those 10 survivors. Hundreds of times in total, pilots suited up and ran through their checklists and launched into the German sky and came back down. Or didn't, because they were convinced that speed above all things was the answer to the war they were losing. They were wrong about the war. They were not wrong about the speed. And in the long record of human beings doing extraordinary, catastrophic, brilliant, and doomed things in the name of getting somewhere faster than anyone had before, the comet sits near the very top of the list. Small, strange, sitting behind glass in a quiet museum, still somehow looking like it's about to move.